Okay, so today's the 13th of March 2013. We're in Mullaney interviewing John Railton, and interviewing you is Robert Riddel and myself, Janina, Gosseye.
Well, I don't have my questions. May I?
Yes.
The first question, what architecture qualifications did you gain and from which institution?
Well, my degree is a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Melbourne in 1960. I started out at the University of Queensland and did, at that stage, the first 3 years, which were full-time study. And then you did the final 3 years, because it was a 6-year course at that time, as a part-time student. And that allowed you to work for other architects, and the other architect I worked for was James Birrell, who was then the Brisbane City Council architect. And he was a graduate of Melbourne University and influenced me sort of substantially in that direction. So during that period of time working for him, I went down to Melbourne and, having never been there, kind of fell in love with a different environment and decided that I would transfer to Melbourne University. So as Melbourne then had a 5-year full-time course, I was able to transfer after 1 year with James into what were the 4th and 5th years of study full-time.
So you started at the University of Queensland, but then transferred
I transferred in those days.
After the first year?
No, 3 years at the University
3
of
years,
Queensland,
and
then transferred while I was working. At that stage, they had a wonderful thing called the Commonwealth Scholarship, which basically paid for your education, and I discovered that if you moved away from where you lived and lived somewhere else, they even paid for you to be accommodated there. So it was sort of a non-expensive idea to transfer, and I loved it. The professor of architecture at that stage was Brian Lewis, who was an English architect who'd worked with Roger Fry, who was quite a name in England at that stage. Gropius, when he left Germany, moved to England before he moved to the United States, and he was a partner with Fry, I believe. And Brian was one of these guys that was the essence of what a professor might be in a faculty where he wished to have some significance and dominance in that faculty. I'm saying this in the sense that at that stage I felt like the Faculty of Architecture at Queensland was like a sub-branch of engineering rather than being a unique entity of its own. And Lewis was really a very promotional kind of person and was able to advance the cause of architecture. And as a result of the connections he had, he brought Fritz Geneva, who was quite a name in architecture, and who was also at the Bauhaus, and Bernard Smith in the arts department. And these people were very influential. I would really say that the University of Melbourne at that stage was a pretty eminent architecture department, relatively to in terms of Australia. I would think, you know, it had Boyd and it had Grounds, it had those sort of people that were significant influences and involved in the department. And through that I also had Bill Carr, who wound up, and you probably know, here in Brisbane, and he was the reason why I actually ended up teaching at the University of Queensland, because when he came up here he asked me if I'd do that. But it was a quite remarkable, energised era of my life.
And what year did you start at the university? 1960
I graduated.
So you were here 60, 61, 62, and then you went to Melbourne 63, 64, or?
No. I was at the University of Queensland 55, 56, 57. I worked 58 for James Birrell, 59, 60, graduated at the end of 60, those 2 years in Melbourne. I then worked in Melbourne for a year. I worked in Sydney for a year, and I came back to Brisbane for that same reason that a number of architects have come back home, which was my parents thought it'd be nice if I designed a house for them.
Which was where?
In Clayfield. No, actually Hamilton. Yes, they were living in Clayfield. I don't know what condition the house is in. I haven't been past it for
But that was a success. They were pleased.
Oh yes, it was quite successful. Yes.
And where was that house?
Hamilton. What? Oh, that's right.
I think it's called Hipwood Street, Bob, but I'm a bit vague about that.
And so 55, 56, 57, you worked for Burrell? Or...
I worked for him during 58.
58. Mm-hmm. And do you remember any of the projects that you worked on while you were...
Oh yes, you know, it's interesting. He specialised in public toilet blocks, I would say, while he was with the Brisbane City Council through that period of time. We did an awful lot of them. And he also did the libraries, at that stage, the Toowong Library.
Mm-hmm.
And the sad thing about Jim Birrell's work is most of it's been pulled down or destroyed. And there was another library at Lutwidge, I think we did. There were about 3 libraries. And I left before... Oh, and the big project, of course, was the swimming pool up on Gregory Terrace, which I worked on.
So you're in Brisbane, and it's 1960 or 1961.
I came back about 62 to Brisbane, and did something probably quite silly, which is that at that stage you actually could just come out of school and, you know, call yourself an architect and start doing work for people. There's very little handicap to that system of... You probably remember it that way. You know, the registration was really a matter of just sending in a form and saying you want to be a registered architect. And I think that it was probably kind of cheeky and naive to do things that way, but architects did do things that way. You know, it really meant that you were left with not a great deal of experience of having worked for other architects. And, I was pretty industrious about working for other architects in the sense that throughout my student days I did always work for architects. I worked for Bates, Martin McCutcheon when I stayed a year in Melbourne, and I worked for Pranglin Crofts at one stage in Brisbane. I also worked for Goodsir and Carlisle, and I worked for David Bell, who had an architectural office in Surfers Paradise. He was doing the Chevron Hotel. And then when I went to Sydney, I worked for Tom Mahoney, and at that stage he was doing the library for the National Library in Canberra and also the University of Sydney Library, and he got the Solomon Award for the library in Canberra, I remember. So I worked on those 2 projects.
This is not the Fisher Library, this is another library at Sydney.
He did the library that's at the University of Sydney.
Which I thought was the Fisher Library.
It is the Fisher Library, that's correct. He was the architect for the Fisher Library.
And I associated that with Ken Woolley, but it's not.
No, I don't believe that's true, but you can check that if you want to. Well, I believe he did the Fisher Library. I remember that as being the name, and I have seen it in the last few years, and I do think it's the same building. And he certainly did do the library in Canberra that is the main national library.
And so you studied both here in Brisbane and you studied in Melbourne. Would you say the education was quite different, or the way they went about it, or what they spoke of? Because we spoke to Richard Stringer and he was talking about Fritz Geneva and saying that he had some peculiar educational techniques and making people aware of what was around them. And
well, I think the difference was that the Melbourne University had a Bauhaus influence that was there, and I think that has instilled in me those influences always. I also, before doing that, I went to Sydney and I met Harry Seidler, and I knew that he'd gone there, and so I was kind of curious about it, you know. And I sort of admired his work to the extent that 2 things happened very early. When I was at school, I decided I wanted to become an architect. Somewhat that was because my father was a furniture maker. And the other reason was that I had seen in the library at school a magazine that had photographs of Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings at Taliesin West. And I also saw in the Courier Mail a photograph of a house in Sydney, which is the Rose Seidler House, of course, which had just won the Solomon Award at that time. And so I thought, gee, this is pretty exciting sort of stuff. And I went down to Sydney in the train and went to the Institute of Architects Convention, which was held in Sydney in 1953. And Seidler, because he had taught or worked with Walter Gropius, invited him to Sydney, and he came to Sydney. And so I went to hear what he had to say, and I introduced myself to Harry and said, you know, that I was interested in doing architecture, and he kind of said, well, the Bauhaus is really something you ought to know a lot about. And it became an interest of mine.
And who were your fellow students at UQ and at...
I was still just a high school student.
No, but when you started, I mean...
That, yes.
Once you started, I mean... Once you started at university, do you remember who your fellow students were, or who?
Yeah. You know, I thought about that when I saw this question. I don't know that it was anybody that, you know, Richard Stringer, of course, was in the same year that I was at Melbourne University. Geoffrey Pye was in, I think, a year below me at the University of Queensland. Other than that, I don't know that there was anybody in my year at the University of Melbourne that pops out as somebody who's now got name recognition. I know two of those people went on to be academics. George Tibbets was one of them, and he's you know, an academic at Melbourne University. He's probably retired now.
And what about the ones at UQ when you first started in 1955? Do you remember anybody who was with you there?
Well, I went to a reunion a couple of years ago and met with a number of these people, but none of them have sort of gone on to be what I think of as being names I recognise. David Rossler was one, and he's been a little bit of an influence in Queensland because he became an authority on Wright's work, and he also lived in America for a lot of years, and he was the architect for, I think, the city of Toowoomba, or an advisor to them when he came back to Australia. This is probably going back about 10 years, and he from time to time gave a talk on Wright's work, and I think he did that at the University of Queensland occasionally.
So, as far as the architectural teachers that you had,
yes,
were any of them ones you remember?
Significantly, I suppose Bill Carr pops to mind immediately. As an influence, I suppose James Birrell, of course, does, although he wasn't really a teacher. And when I came back here, I became quite friendly with Morris Hurst, and, you know, I think he was sort of an influence. And quite obviously, because Melbourne University then was somewhat dominated architecturally by the Boyd Grounds sort of influence, which was just a group of so many other architects that were of the same ilk, you know, that was an influence that was strong in terms of architecture there, as well as influencing me in that regard.
And do you remember Professor Cummings and Bruce Lucas at UQ?
Oh yes, I do remember Professor Cummings quite well, and I don't think he grasped sufficiently for my interest the essence of architecture. I think he was a beaux arts guy, and I was not, you know, and I think that was probably a very different... I already had a mindset that had some ideas of architecture that were 20th century influenced in terms of what I've said, and I don't think they were influences that the University of Queensland understood at that stage.
And they certainly didn't teach them.
No, exactly.
So you were learning from other sources.
Yes, Robert, that's true.
And can you remember where you got these things? I mean, you said Birrell. And you
probably because I just was that I admired, names in architecture that went beyond here, and thought that they were more international than what we were in Queensland, and therefore the significance of Seidler in Sydney, and the significance of the Bauhaus, and the significance of Wright's work, and these things were something that I had started to have come into my life, and I don't think they had come into education in Queensland at that stage.
Well, did you take, this is question 5, did you undertake any other tertiary study?
No, I'd say I really didn't. I basically have spent my life as a working architect. I did not go to America with the intention of studying. I really went there with the intention of just being a practitioner and learning as much as I could about architecture and building. And I didn't pursue academically any other studies. I didn't acquire other degrees. My teaching has been very brief. It was for about those 3 years in the University of Queensland when I was a part-time tutor. At one stage I worked with Peter O'Gorman, and he got quite sick, and I took over, I think it was second year, for a part of the year while he was not well, and worked as the studio master for second year during that period of time. At that stage, Cummings had left, and there was somebody else that was the professor who came after him.
Before Balsani arrived.
Before Balsani arrived, yes.
It just escapes me, but I know.
Yeah, I've forgotten too.
Ian Cinnamon?
No, he wasn't the head. Gareth.
Roberts?
Was it Gareth Roberts who was the person?
Yes, I think so. Yes, he was. Yeah, he was English.
So you were teaching for which years now?
I was teaching probably part-time for probably like 62 to 65.
And running a practice at the same time?
Yes, meagerly.
And that practice, as I remember it, was from Grenier Street.
That's correct, underneath the house.
Yes.
And at that stage I did mostly houses, some additions and alterations which architects get when they're starting out. And other than the Grenier Street house, the significant houses from that period are probably the Wilson's house, which is up here in Dickey Beach. And then I did 3 or 4 other houses, and I have photographs of those. But I stayed here for very little length of time. I had a very meagre practice. It was substantially underwritten by financial assistance by doing some teaching, and I probably did no more than in those few years a dozen projects. It was very small.
So what year did you leave?
I left here in 1970. Mid-1970, and went directly to the United States. I had very little interest in going anywhere else. I think because of what I've said, those influences of architects in America were significant to me. I was quite fascinated by that idea. I thought at that stage that architects generally were heading off to Europe, particularly England, because it was a very easy thing to do. Going to America was a very difficult thing to do. America was a very expensive country at that stage, and also they weren't very receptive to people just wandering into their place and working there. I went there illegally. I took a job. I got by. and it worked out extraordinarily well, and I stayed on as a result of that. I worked briefly in New York for about a year. I think you work there predominantly because it's a place you really want to know. It's very hard to get a good job there. And that was the period when I worked for the Copeland, Novak and Israel company that did the shopping centres. And I thought really that perhaps my time there was coming to an end, but before I gave up on the idea I might go searching around further, and I went on a driving tour with Sue, and at that stage I had a daughter who was about 3, and we just drove around, and I just inquired from various, mostly the Institute of Architects, which is the easiest thing to do, and you phone them in a city and you ask them if there's anybody looking for somebody to work for them. And I went to a place called Cleveland, Ohio, which is an industrial city, and coming from New York winter, it was beautifully sunny and had a lovely blue lake, and I thought this place looks kind of really nice. And I again did that, phoned the Institute and talked with a wonderful lady named Rosemary, who became a good friend, and she told me of a guy named Bill Trout, who was like myself, I suppose, a small architect doing mostly residential work, doing it from a suburban location. And I went and spoke with him, and we seemed interested in each other, and I spent 7 years there. We did significant, interesting houses, I'd call them, and I just I found myself so enmeshed in that and so enjoying that I didn't really want to leave. And during that period of time, I did some work in Colorado, which was my introduction to being there, and I thought it was also fantastic. And I actually owned a small unit there, so I spent time there. And around about 1980, some things happened. The economy deteriorated quite badly in what was called the Rust Belt of America, which was cities like Pittsburgh and Cleveland. And I thought that perhaps staying on there and bringing up what were then 3 children in my life was not really such a very good idea. And I saw business opportunities kind of waning. And I thought seriously of making this move to Colorado, but I saw that as difficult. And John Davis, who you mentioned the other day, came over to America and stayed with me, and he was doing quite a lot of work in Sydney and doing it for the Sydney Cove Redevelopment Authority, and said, well, why don't you come out to Sydney and work in Sydney? And so in 1980 I did do that. I came out and stayed for 2 years and worked with John in Sydney.
Sorry, you
John
worked...
Davis.
Which years were they?
1980, 81.
And what projects were those that you...
Where was that?
Which projects did you work on?
Well, I worked with John Davis, an architect whose company then was called Davis, Heather and Dysart, and they were the architects for the redevelopment of the Rocks area. And it was under an authority called the Sydney Cove Redevelopment Authority. And the major building that they had at that stage was to restore a brick warehouse type building into a hotel, which became Old Sydney Inn. And also at that stage they hooked up with Harry Seidler, and together they did the Grosvenor Square, Grosvenor Place project in the Rocks area.
And after that you went back to the US? Or...
Well, it's a curious story. I was there for those 2 years. I became somewhat disenchanted in the sense that I found that being involved with Sydney Cove Redevelopment Authority was a very political kind of thing, and I found frustration in the sense that I think for every 50 drawings you did, only one got used. It seemed to me like that they weren't really... They were experimenting more with what they might do rather than actually doing things. and I promoted the idea. I promoted a few ideas with them. One was that they might start selling off some of the land down there, and I thought that would be a far better thing to do rather than having it as leasehold land, and they didn't see it that way at all. And I also felt very strongly that if I was going to be an architect, I'd like to see things really happen rather than spend so much time at meetings. And at that same stage, to a great curiosity, I got a letter from the United States saying, would I like to come back to Colorado? And so I did.
And how come you got a letter to ask you to come back?
Because I'd done work there, and because I was
from a fellow architect, or it was
yes, from another architect, as well as from clients that were there that I had worked with. Because as I said, when I had the office in Cleveland, we had this opportunity to do some work in Colorado, and that took me out there.
Yes.
And as a result of that, I really thought if I was to go back to live in America, that I couldn't think of a better place to go back to live than Colorado. And I did do that in about 1982, and I stayed on there until I came back to Australia in 2000.
And you had your own practice from that point on. When you went back in 1982, that was your own practice that you started in Colorado?
Actually, no. It was, at first, I practiced by myself for a short while there. Mm-hmm. I found that I couldn't get enough work, frankly. And then I went down to Boulder, which is the university town for Colorado, and I had architects there. One of whom was Don Woolard, who's also an architect that you might know of because he was a teacher at the University of Queensland at one stage, and then he went on to become a teacher at St. Louis Obispo and also at Boulder. And so my sort of connections with Don made me look for other architects in that area. And I felt somewhat stagnant in the sense that I felt that I'd spent far too much time doing just residential work and working more by myself. And I also saw some things happening in architecture in terms of computerization and CAD programs and energy issues. And this was during the stage in America when the Carter administration was pumping money and incentives into energy issues. And they were promoting the shale oil industry, which Colorado has a lot of. And so I thought perhaps by being involved, perhaps I'm selling Robert something that he's recognised recently too, in another company and in a bigger company, might be something that would be something I should do at this stage in my life. You know, this is where I'm sort of 50-ish and I'm thinking this might be what I want to do. And it fitted in, of course, with the fact that I had a shortage of work, really. And so I went down and I joined two younger architects in Boulder, and that actually grew into a quite large company, and we did a lot of planning work and a lot of commercial work, shopping centre work, office buildings.
And what was the company called?
It was called Melbourne Span. And it eventually became a cumbersome name, which was Melbourne, Span, McAvoy, Railton and Coburn, which was terribly difficult to answer the phone saying. Because as often happens in these sort of practices, eventually you sort of wind up more in bed with one person than another, and Philip and I seemed to feel that we were more comfortable as a separate practice, and so we broke away, and that became Railton McAvoy, which is the company that exists to this day, actually. And it's based in Colorado, in Boulder. During that period of time, because I was living essentially in Vail, which is the ski resort area, and that's where I had first moved to, I opened a separate office in Vail, actually in Avon, which is a small town adjacent to Vail. And so I spent a couple of days a week there, and then I spent some time down in Boulder. And towards the last couple of years that I was there, I did actually basically leave the Boulder office, except as a sort of a design consultant, because I had acquired enough work and I got a bit tired of travelling back and forth, and so I worked basically then out of Vail, the Vail area.
And it was still the larger projects when you were Railton McElroy? Or
Yes, it's still just a small practice.
small, but large projects. You were saying you were doing commercial projects.
We actually were architects and planners, and in the United States you don't have to have a separate degree. You can register as a planner with an architecture degree, and we did a lot of land planning, subdivision type land planning, and to this day, I guess I'd say it's still just a small office with a mixture of work, you know.
And going from Australia to the US, did you feel like your education here was sufficient or was adequate to practice in the US?
No, you sort of go into a learning curve when you go to any other country to live, you know, and you sort of, that's part of the excitement, you know, is that it's. I remember going to this office in New York and I thought, this is amazing, this is not like Australia. They have the radio going while you're working, you know. I don't think anyone in Australia would ever dream of doing that back then. And there were actually people then that didn't show up to work with a tie on. And there was sort of like, I think it's interesting. I think that I wrote an article a few years about this. I think there was a time in America when America was at a certain kind of peak. And I think that peak was what I walked in on, you know, and I think at that stage America was really very, very substantially ahead of Australia in what I call mental attitudes to a lot of things, even in architecture, certainly in terms of business, certainly in terms of education, and you know, I think that's done that, you know. I think that America's declined, Australia's climbed through that.
I mean, you think that's the same world that's portrayed in Mad Men?
I don't see it that much, but I think that's right, you know. I think, you know, I grew up in an Australia that was made in a mental image of America to a large degree, and there's still some of that, but you know, you really did have a country which was culturally not significant in its own right during that period of time. It didn't have a movie industry, it didn't have a music industry, it didn't have those things that America provided for us, you know. And so I think if you grew up in the 50s and 60s, to a large degree you were substantially Americanized in that way, you know. You went to movies and so there was from my point of view anyway, there was an incredible fascination with all that didn't exist for me with regard to Europe. And it was probably instigated somewhat by the fact that my father's sister married an American as a war bride, as they call them, and she went there to live and she came back here to visit. And so this was really where I wanted to be. And so that was the attraction to doing that.
So you had first-hand experience?
Yes, right. Yeah.
And did you have holidays there or anything?
No, I'd never been there till I went over there in 1970. No.
Right. No. So can I just take you back to when you started practicing in Brisbane?
Yes.
In that modest way that you described?
Yes.
You had some people who worked with you or for you?
Yes. In fact, you know them, I think.
I probably know
the
some of them.
first person that worked for me was Doug Mackay, who still has an office and he's probably the architect that does a lot of the nice houses around the Palm Beach area in Sydney, because he lived there all his life. S.B. Dodds worked for me for a while, and the other person who did work with me was
did Richard Allen work there?
No, isn't that terrible?
It'll come to you.
Richard Allen.
Richard Allen, yes.
I said that because he's worked in the same sort of field that you've worked in to some degree, hasn't he? Historical work.
And we have worked together.
Yes.
For quite a while. So, did those people have any contributions to make to what
well,
you were
I think
doing?
that, you know, well, all students have contributions. You know, I suppose I'd have to say I picked them because they were good students, and
Well, they all went on and did things
yes, that's right,
in a significant way, so they weren't just
no.
the average.
No.
And I guess you've talked about moving abroad. Did you ever have the opportunity to work on something bigger than a house while you were in Brisbane?
Yes, I do say that the dominance of my architectural life has been residential work, but when you get into any practice, you sort of get involved in other projects as it grows, and so the practice involved grew to the stage that you couldn't support it with residential work. So we did do, apart from the planning work, we did. I think we did 3 schools during that period of time. I did some work on the school in Vale. I did a small medical clinic during that period of time in Vale.
But not in Brisbane. You didn't do anything.
No.
That wasn't commercial
I'm sorry,
in Brisbane.
I was misunderstanding your question. No, during the period of time that I worked in Brisbane, I did just these renovations to houses, and nothing really beyond that in terms of commercial work, other than the period of time when I worked for Rob Gibson.
Oh, now when was that, and how long for?
I worked for Rob during 1969-70, and probably not for even perhaps about a year. It was not a very long period.
And what did you work on there?
I worked on the interiors for retail stores in the shopping centres with Bob Mathers and Wallace Bishop. And then, towards the end of that period of time, when Rob got the work for the University of Queensland, I can remember a day sitting out there on the ground with him at the university and talking about how he might design the library building, and so I worked on that. He was kind and respectful of the fact that I was a design type architect, I guess I'd put it to you, and so he took me into his confidence in nice ways, you know. And I felt a little awkward about that relative to other people in the company at times, but I thought he was very thoughtful about that. And so he and I sort of looked at how you might go about design aspects, and whether he remembers it that way, I don't know.
And how come you got to work for Robin Gibson at...
Well, I knew him, and I also had planned to leave Australia and go to America. I had sold my house in Grenier Street and moved out of it. The result of that really was that I was sort of closing up my office here. There is a period of time when if you're leaving a place, you can't take on work because you aren't going to be there to do it. So, and I didn't have enough work either. And so I went and had a chat to him and said, can I come and work for you during this interim period of time? And that's what happened.
So that was the closest thing to a collaboration with an Australian architect.
Yes, I suppose, yes.
Now, those projects, the library and the main hall, as it was, on 2 sides of the principal face.
The library, if I remember, was done first, and then the main hall was done. And they were actually constructed after I left. It was just during that stage when I was there that they were doing the design work on those buildings.
Now, there was a 3rd building that was proposed that I'd never seen in the centre, that was right in front of the tower for Australian studies.
Oh, really?
That wasn't discussed?
No, not that I remember, no.
And the Vice-Chancellor at the time was fairly influential, Zelman Cowan.
Yes.
And I don't know exactly when he arrives at the university, but he said that he would only come to that position if they allowed him to design a house of his choosing to live in.
Okay.
Yes. And this was the Vice-Chancellor's residence that he said he wanted Robin Boyd to do.
Yes.
And Robin Boyd said, no, I won't do this house. You get somebody local.
Yes.
And I...
Because he had lived in a Robin Boyd house in Melbourne.
And I don't know whether he suggested John Dalton or somebody else did.
Oh, yeah.
John Dalton did the house.
I remember that, yes.
Did you ever see that house?
I think I did it somewhere near the university, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's slightly Japanese influenced.
Well,
in the sense that it had a courtyard, if I'm remembering it.
It had a courtyard, and it had a double height space with a sort of gallery that ran across it.
Oh, yes, yeah.
At an upper level. That house is gone now, so apart from Dick Stringer's photographs of it,
yes,
it's a memory. But
so is Wilson's house, I believe, because John Dalton did their house at Toowong. And I think it's also been demolished.
Okay. Now, what did you think of John Dalton, actually?
Oh, I thought he was a very good architect. I didn't know him particularly personally, but no, I think Hayes and Scott were another. There were firms of that period that were very good and doing very nice work. Prangley and Crofts were another of a like. They were sort of a school in the sense that there's a group of architects that do work that's somewhat similar, and I fit those people together. I also would think that they had influences that were ahead of and beyond what the University of Queensland was teaching in that stage. I think they were significant in another way, and perhaps they didn't influence that enough because Cam Scott taught part-time at the university, I think, and I don't know that John did.
Well, what about Murray Hurst?
Well, Murray Hurst also, and he did teach there, and he taught there at the same stage that I did, and I think that he was English, and so he brought another influence into it, but it certainly was a very, very contemporary influence, and I think even to this day, I know well one of his houses because it's lived in by David and Rhoda Nicholson, who worked with Morris for many years in Noosa, and every time I go into that house, I think what a lovely feeling it has, and what a lovely sense of simple materials and simple spaces, and he had a wonderful sense of the Australian bush and how to relate things to the Australian environment. And he didn't want a view of the ocean from his house, so he let all the trees grow in front of it. And then when he died, they had to sell his house, so they had to cut down all the trees, or nobody would buy it.
And I suppose, even though the trees are there, you can hear the ocean, and that might have been enough.
Yes.
So this is the hard one, number 6 on the first sheet. Which buildings constructed in Queensland between 45 and 75 do you consider significant?
Well, I actually wrote down there that I think of Birrell as doing significant things for Queensland, and as I say, I think the sad news is that even though he got a gold medal, there wasn't that much stuff left that hadn't either been tarted up or destroyed, and I think the architects that were that group that we'll call around the Hayes and Scott, Prangley and Croft, somewhat later Rob Gibson, they're the significant architects in my thoughts about that. And by that period of time.
I mean,
I don't think the big architects, without being uncomfortable in my thoughts or not kind, were doing what I'd call the quality work of that period.
Yeah, well, I mean, Conrad and Gargett, which I was with when I first started, were doing hospitals.
Yes.
But some of those hospitals I thought were quite interesting and accomplished. And they were also doing office buildings, like the MLC building, which is really Bates Smart, but they were looking after it.
Yes,
and,
that's right.
I thought that was a very fine piece of work, whereas some of the ones they did later than that, like the Executive Building in George Street or the SGIO, the Commonwealth Bank, I liked. I thought that's nicely sort of thought about, and I can remember that being done. But yes, they were kind of the pedestrian architects of their day in a way, and they were doing an awful lot of work.
Yes, that's right.
And a lot of it But, you know, they did win some competitions. The Women's College out at University of Queensland is one that I can remember. And but a very different firm. And I mean, after I was there for 2.5 years, I thought, well, time to move on to someone who's a bit more, a bit cooler.
Yes, that's it. Yes.
So one did, and I guess we should move on to name number 7. Name the architects, international or local, and from any period that have had a formative influence on your architectural outlook.
Well, I wrote down the obvious names that everybody who has been, you know, of my time in architecture, because the names were people like Frank Lloyd Wright, they were people like Mies and Corbusier and Gropius, and so there was like the European school of what became modern architecture, the international style, as Philip Johnson called it, were really, if you were thinking broadly as an architect, they were sort of substantial names and therefore substantial designers. And so living in Australia, it's like living in Australia with regard to art, or at that period of time, theatre even. You know, your contact with that is in a book. It's not in reality. And so I went to America, of course, to work there, but I also went there to have that reality as part of my life, you know, that I could go up and touch Frank Lloyd Wright buildings and walk inside of them and see them.
And did you?
And I did. Oh, yes, I did extensively. I probably worked my way through a very large number of them. I've seen some of Mies' work because it's there, you know. You go downtown to Denver and there's a Mies building, you know. You go downtown in the cities that were being built, and if it's not a Mies building, then it's an I.M. Pei building, or it's a building of significance in terms of name architects, if we want to call them that, of that period of time. I have not seen a lot of Corbusier's work. I've seen Chandigarh in India, and I've seen he did a lovely building called the Carpenter Building at Harvard University, but just to be able to be a part of the reality of 20th century architecture was something you couldn't do here.
Somewhere else.
Yeah.
Well, Louis Kahn is someone you've mentioned a couple of times.
Yeah, and people have written about him as being an influence. And I think there's probably, I've never thought about it that way, but there's probably some truth. Again, I've seen a bit of his work. I have been to every state in America except Alaska. And so that tells you what I did with my time there, which was that every time I got a chance, I travelled as much as I could and wanted to see the country. And a lot of that travel had to do with wanting to look up particular buildings. You know. I've written a little bit about the nasty man of architecture, which is Philip Johnson, because people speak poorly of him. But you know, this is disappointing to me. But in terms of America, and it's happening here now, it's starting to be better. But in terms of America, I thought there was at that stage, you know, there were sort of like dominant people that were very outspoken and very significant and were very public in where they stood with regard to architecture. You know, the obvious name is Ada Louise Huxtable, because she was an architectural critic of such enormous power and significance. You know, this woman could tell people, you know, to go away. She was even better than Prince Charles at being able to do this. I mean, she could really, you know, wreck them if she wanted to. She had that kind of capacity as a writer with the New York Times, and you know, you used to get the Sunday paper so you could read her column and see who she was pulling up the ladder or throwing down into the pit.
Did you ever meet her?
No, she died just
the other day.
in
January this year. Yeah.
And you know, there was people like Rachel Carson, and there were people like the woman in New York who also died recently, who wrote the book on planning.
Jane Jacobs? No.
Yes,
Okay.
Jane Jacobs. Yes.
Right.
And so there were these strong voices, you know, and there were Philip Johnson was a strong voice. He was not only outrageously outspoken, but he was making architects. You know, he was encouraging architecture. He was involving controversial discussion in those areas.
Well, Boyd was here.
But Boyd was here, and Boyd was. I think we haven't had another Boyd. You know, I think that's the problem, and I think we are. I just thought that sort of recently we're starting to have a bit more public voice about architecture than we've had, but I think it's been pretty absent for quite a long while, really. You know?
So there were big competitions, like in Australia for Parliament House. Did you
Yes.
ever think seriously of doing that?
No.
And I mean, Jogala was doing it from
Yes, from America.
Yes.
Mm.
And you know, small practitioners like Rex Addison
Yes,
would have a go
exactly.
And he was in Papua New Guinea at the time.
That was wonderful.
Did you ever enter competitions?
I entered one for a mathematics building at Cambridge University when we had the office in Cleveland, but we didn't get that. I entered one for when I was working with Batesbart McCutcheon together with them for the City Hall at Redcliffe, and also with Don Bailey was there at that stage, and we entered one for the building in Perth that he actually did get, and then he moved to Perth to do that building. But I can't think of any others that I have.
Well, do you feel your practice has had any impact on present-day architecture in Queensland?
I think it's no, really, to be honest about it. I think I did so
That's
little.
not what
and
I
went
thought.
away for so long.
Yes, I know, but I mean,
the very fact that you guys are sitting here with me must tell me that a bit of the answer is yes. You know, but the truth is that I think you're young, you're inexperienced, and you get given an opportunity, and you take it, and you do certain things that eventually. I mean, they just recently published the house in Greenwich Street in Houses magazine, you know. So you have to sort of say that there's something that happened that was good and that was part of what you did. But I think probably, in a selfish way, I probably deprived myself in the place of what might have been more significance by not being here. You know, if you're not there, you can't do the work. Yeah, and I don't think because the American pool is such an enormously big pool, with such an awful lot of big fish in it, that it's the same game in terms of significance that Australia is.
Oh, absolutely not. But people like Doug Mackay, S.P. Dodds, Richard Allam all took something from you and made it into something else.
Along with other people.
Yes. But I mean, and they weren't the only ones.
No,
I mean, they didn't have to work for you to be influenced. But I remember as I was a student going to Grenier Street.
Oh, yes.
And I was taken there by, I can't think it was Bruce Goodseye, but
yes.
I can't really remember how we got there. But, and being so impressed, with the
nice thing about that building is that it's still very intact, and it's in still very good condition, and it's still nicely lived in, you know. And in my mind, that's
John
wonderful.
Roberts, does he still own it?
No, some woman owns it whose name I forget. And then I sold it to an American academic at the stage that I sold, but it's been sold a few times since. But when I last knew of who was living there, it was being rented to some guy who was a graphic designer, and he was living in it very nicely. The guy who keeps tabs on it is James Russell, and he talks to me about who's there.
So how do you know him?
Well, I know him because I was looking at a building in the valley one day next to a church, and as I looked up at it, I thought, you know, it's kind of got a bit of a front elevation that looks a little bit like the Grenier Street house. And so I contacted him, because I thought it was a nice building too. And he said, oh, you know, I know who you are, I know the house in Grenier Street. But he said, I deny any influence. I'm not tagging you at any...
Well, we helped him get his approvals on that, because building it close to the church was controversial.
Yes. He's moved out of it, doesn't live in it anymore.
One of his kids fell out a window or something, and his wife said, that's it, we're moving.
Anyway, and so he was the one who contacted me about this article in the Houses magazine.
Well, I'd missed that. I must say, I didn't know it was in there. But I can remember being shown something down at Palm Beach that you'd done. And that was on the beachfront.
Yes, okay. Oh, gee, yeah. Little beach house right on the ocean at Palm Beach.
Well, who was that for?
That was actually for my parents also.
Oh.
It was a very, very lightweight frame building of two little plywood, I suppose they were asbestos cement boxes as they would have been back then, with just a sort of a courtyard walkway space in between them, one of which they used as a weekender and the other one they rented out.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose that's gone, is it?
It's the shelves underneath what's there now, so I sense when I look at it. I looked at it a few years ago and there's no recognition. You know. The other house that's still intact, I'm told by the owner, was the Melodic House, which was out at Everton Park. Mm-hmm. And Harry, who died a couple of years ago when he came out to Australia, contacted me and told me that it was still in good order and nicely looked after. And I went looking for it one day and I couldn't find it. The other houses that I did in Brookfield, I went past maybe more than 10 years ago, and they had been sufficiently altered that I didn't recognise them.
Well, the thing is, that can be reversed if you really wanted to.
Sure.
Which is the kind of thing we did with our
that's
West's
right.
building. But you know, you have to want to do it.
Yes.
It does not. It's just putting the right owner in touch with the right opportunity and giving them what they need, which is the drawings and some photographs and some information.
Well, Wilson's house has been sold to people who are going to keep it in order. You know, they're people you know because they live in a house that you assisted them with.
I talked them into it.
Oh, did you? Good on you.
And I mean, Jerry Murtagh tried very hard to have that house listed so it would be protected. And there was a lot of resistance to doing that, and it didn't get listed.
I have to be honest with you. And you might like me for it. I partly participated in that. I had some reasons for that. Patrick Wilson was dying at that stage, and it was something that concerned him considerably, that if that happened it might go down in value, and that was the only significant thing he was leaving. And he also felt quite sure that it wouldn't come down anyway, irrespective of that, because of the Caloundra Council and other people also were opposed to seeing that happen.
But these things can disappear, and I guess... but this is in safe hands now, and perhaps...
That's right, that's right.
We hope it'll go on.
Yeah, and I sense that might be true of Grenier Street, you know, which has not been listed. But, you know, I do think that it's a building that there'll probably be some opposition to it coming down, even by the council, because it is significant of that period, and councils are now more accommodating in terms of those sort of views.
And I mean, this study is to assist that process by trying to work out, well, what are the significant buildings of this period, and we should look after them.
Sure.
And I mean, when the first Birrell buildings came up to the Heritage Council for consideration, I mean, they were very difficult. People didn't like them.
Well, it was very sad what happened at Tuong, I thought, because I thought that was a lovely little library, really. You know.
Well, the library's still there, but
but it's not really what you'd say was a kind of an intact building.
No, it's not intact. It's been altered, but I suppose the not as badly affected as Centenary Pool has.
Yes,
big thing grafted onto it.
Yes, that's right.
And the council car park at Wickham Terrace has had a little change, but it's still there.
No, I thought that it was still pretty much the same from seeing it. Yeah.
Oh well, it's had it's been made safer.
Yeah. Oh, I suppose you're right. I suppose his University of Queensland buildings are still fairly much in order, aren't they? Yeah.
And one has to keep telling people that they are important, or they'll change them. But the next stage is that once they do get recognition in a more public way, then they do get looked after to a higher standard.
Yes.
Some of the bad things that have happened in the past will be reversed, and you hope that they'll be appreciated for what they were.
And we're very, very conscious of that now. That's a really big improvement. Yeah.
And I suppose we were the last part of Australia to really accept that. Legislation here didn't happen until 30 years after it had happened in Melbourne, for instance.
Oh, was that?
So a lot of things were lost.
Yes.
Well, I think...
I go down to Sandgate occasionally, and it's quite lovely because Sandgate has got a lot of stuff that's very intact. It has a lot of houses that are what you'd call Queenslanders. And I think that happened because nobody wanted to go to Sandgate at the stage when everybody was tearing buildings down, And so unlike Clayfield, where I lived, where it went through that period where, lovely houses, one in the street that I faced in Clayfield got torn down and a six-plex brick flat thing went up, with an old Queenslander next door, as well as the old Queenslander got taken down. And we don't do that. We're beyond that now. But places like Sandgate were not developed or desirable, and so they stayed together.
So, when you talk about Birrell, which Birrell building do you think is the one?
The one.
Is it Union College?
I think I was going to say Union College.
JD
Bruce
Story
worked on it, and the fireplace is rather wonderful. And I think it's Birrell's an interesting guy because he really moved his mind around through an awful lot of variations in architectural influence. I mean, he did sort of Mies van der Rohe sort of toilet blocks, and then he moved on to Corbusier swimming pools, and then he moved on to the brutalist periods of Union College.
Was that all coming from him, or was it coming from his staff, and he allowed it to happen?
I can't remember well enough how loose he was with you in his office. I'm a bit vague about that. I don't think of him as being dictatorial in the sense that Cider and Grounds would be as an office person. I think he probably was reasonably open about those sort of things.
Well, there were some good people there.
Yeah. Oh, yes, he did have
like
people.
Laurie Cully and
yes, that's right.
And Bruce Goodsoe, for instance.
Yes, Bruce worked for a lot of people that were significant worked for him when he became University of Queensland Architecture. Rex worked for him. Doug Mackay worked for him.
Yes. Don
Watson worked for him. Sure.
So, presumably these people were responsible for some of the details anyway, if not the thinking.
Oh yes.
And I agree. There's a very wide variety of where these things are coming from, and that's what makes it interesting. But then, years later, all of that seems to have dropped off, and
well, he did some things I don't think he wants us to talk about too much.
Well, what about Robin Gibson? Which is his best work?
Well, I think the whole culture centre is really quite significant, because it was a group of buildings, and I think when you get a group of buildings that's under one architect, then you get a kind of an environmental impact that's not just a building. And I think it's significant in the sense that it brought a kind of an entity to a part of Brisbane that was very important because they were the ratty sort of part of Brisbane. And you look across to it and you see it as sort of like a significant group of alike structures that sit there together.
And I guess some of the criticism that was given to it in later years was the fact that it didn't seem to have any connection to the streets that it was on. It was entered via a car park or at an upper level, and it actually didn't respond to...
They've had some circulation problems with it, and they've obviously corrected some of those in recent times. They've recently reworked the theatre complex in terms of how it circulates. And of course they did that connecting bridge sort of thing, which Railton did design, I believe, that connected the buildings together in a better way.
And he designed a new front to the museum.
That's right, which I think is also quite a nice glass.
I thought it wasn't as nice as it could have been.
Oh,
or as good as the original.
It pulls the building into the garden space, and that sort of. I think my criticism of the gallery, which I enjoyed visually very much, but it was a period of time when there wasn't the same understanding of natural light that there is now in gallery design, and so it's not naturally lit, and as a result of that I don't think it's very good from an energy point of view, and I think gallery design now has moved towards natural lighting very strongly. And I think probably the art gallery that most gallery directors go to when they're thinking of hiring an architect seems to be the Kimball in Euston by Kahn, because it seems to be like the high water mark of a gallery, and particularly in terms of natural lighting.
Well, I've never seen it, but I've seen pictures of it.
Yeah.
And I know that it's top lit and so on.
They added to it recently. And the architect that added to it was Roach, who grew out of Saarinen office, and they were amazed because he presented the design to them, and they said, "Well, it's not any different." He said, "No, who would want to make it any different?"
Well, what about buildings like the Opera House? I mean, you were around when that was being built?
I'm not a fan of the Opera House.
That's interesting. Are you a fan of putting a building like that on that site?
Yes, I'd say I am with that, in the sense that I think a very sculptural thing is significant in terms of where it's located.
I mean, if it were to happen today, it probably wouldn't have been allowed because there was an historic aspect to that site that would have
the
had
old
to
tram
be
station
protected.
and those sort of aspects. Yes.
Now, that brings me back to the rocks redevelopment and the green bands and the whole of that. I mean, Seidler did a scheme to redesign the whole of the rocks.
Liberate that. Yeah. Yes, he did.
And I mean, where did you stand in that?
I have. Oh boy, we're in trouble here. I have a lot of difficulty. I'll preface this by saying something like this, and that is, this country has not got a very long history of man-made environments. And so we have a certain short period of time where we built things, some of which is significant. In recent years, we have become appreciative of that and observed that as something we should do something better with in terms of preservation. We went through a vandalistic period. But places like Europe in particular, and a lot of countries, and somewhat America because it fits in between those periods of time, have had this stuff around for a lot longer, and so they have a different kind of attitude to it. And I think that there's some things we sort of want to preserve for what I think of as being like mixed reasons, you know. And some of that's got a little bit of nostalgia to it, and I'm not too keen on that being, you know. In other words, I think that it's hard to lift the game when the numbers are a bit low, and I think that's probably where I feel like we are maybe overreaching now, and we've stepped back from that a little bit because we're getting better at allowing buildings that are significant to be altered in a way that is more contemporary and that is more thoughtful in terms of what you might say is being built today. Now, Europe's very good at that. I think Europe has a nice attitude to old buildings in the sense that it says we don't want to destroy what it's about, but we don't want to try and fit in with what it's about entirely. And we do want to bring some vitality to what we might now do with that building that speaks of where we are now and where we are in terms of time frame and culture and other things like that.
Well, Scarpa does this.
Yes.
Very nicely.
Yes. Yes. A number of European architects do this well.
Can you think of any others?
Well, I think the guy who does it fairly poorly is the English Lord, what's his name?
Rogers.
Foster.
Foster.
Yes. I don't think he does it well.
No.
You know. Even the bubble on top of the thing in Berlin is just very uncertain about it.
Well, that whole field became a subject of study and debate.
Yes.
As to about how you make these decisions.
Yes.
About this concept of cultural significance, which is not necessarily to do with architectural quality at all. It's to do with, well, what is the meaning of this to future people?
That's right.
And
that's right.
Australia actually has been quite at the forefront of that debate.
Yes.
I mean, which started in Europe with UNESCO and
Yes.
ICOMOS and based in Paris, but to try and come to terms with, well, how do you measure cultural significance, and then once you've measured it, what do you do then?
Yes. Yes.
And the Borough Charter, which Richard Allen was one of the people who was responsible for drafting that document.
Oh yes.
Is now considered and the most widely used of those documents in anywhere. So these things kind of led somewhere, but it took that turmoil of what was going on in the rocks and those kind of debates which were fought on all sorts of different levels.
Yes.
About, well, are these people who are demonstrating against progress or modern architecture or whatever? I mean, where are they coming from, and are they nutters, or are they fighting the good fight?
Yeah. Well, for example, like Grosvenor Place in Sydney, they insisted upon certain buildings that are sort of kind of tucked under the building being kept, and I, of course, thought that was pretty stupid. And I sort of agree in this sense that I think when you start to just sort of say they're sort of facades that we value, then I think you've either got to say we're prepared to take it down, or we're prepared to not let this other thing happen, but we're not prepared to sort of kind of pretend that we're sort of preserving this thing when in point of fact it looks rather foolish in the end result, and I think that's happened a bit with buildings.
Well, I mean, in Brisbane, it was never an issue really, because you just got rid of it.
Yes.
I mean, when Seidler came to do Riverside, there was a lovely Robin Dodds building there on the site, and I mean, it was just whoosh.
Yes.
And I mean, it could quite easily have been left there, and you could have built around it, but it was just never a consideration.
Yes. But that probably wouldn't happen today.
Oh no, it wouldn't happen today. But the judgment is not made on how good a piece of architecture it is. It's made on a much wider set of criteria.
Well, often it's basically a business judgment, really, a financial judgment.
No. The Borough Charter means that you have to go through
I mean
process.
when the Seidler's decision was made, I
Seidler's,
think that's really a financial decision.
Well, you get more on if you can get a free site.
That's right.
I mean, that's still happening, but you now employ a whole lot of consultants to prove that something doesn't have significance.
Yes.
And so you can get rid of it and build something else. But it seemed to me that a lot of the arrogance that goes with, well, whatever we do will be better, and that attitude is not as interesting to me as the one that says, well, that has some quality and we can work with that.
Yes.
Which is kind of, and Scarpa is the best person I know who actually developed that to a very high level, and yet I think he would have had trouble doing some of the things he did, which I think are brilliant here, because he'd have to argue in a way that he never had to do there. So it's an interesting area. But tell me about the Opera House. The reason I think why the Opera House is on that site comes back to help me. Karl Langer. Karl Langer did a master plan or some plan for the Cumberland Council, which controlled it, and he suggested that they use that site for that purpose, and his friend was Goossens, and they talked about how they might get a competition to get it there.
Yes.
And then how it would be.
I've not heard this story.
Well, I think I'm not sure that that's correct, but that's what I've been told, and it needs more research. So, okay, we picked that site, which at the time you were allowed to because no one questioned it, and then you have an international competition, and you choose something that's by an architect who really hasn't done very much. They didn't quite know how they were going to build it.
Highly influenced by Saarinen, who was on the judging panel.
Yes.
Who sort of more or less insisted that be the design.
And he came in late, and they had already discarded it, but he was able to influence choosing it. Yeah. But I mean, you'd have to say, from those first sketches to what it finished up being, I mean, it went through enormous refinement.
Oh yes, yes, it did. Yes.
Well, it was just that
Well, any architect's going to have a problem with it because, it's a compromised building in the end. So that's the issue that you have. You say, well, it's got an outside and an inside, and they aren't really talking to each other too well. But I probably go a little more beyond that in the sense that. I guess it goes right back to where I started, which is that I have enough of what I call the fundamentals of Bauhaus in the sense of forms and the functions of forms as such to have a little bit of a problem with a kind of a really lovely cake with something inside of it, and I'm sorry if that's offensive, but I sort of feel that way a little bit about it, that it's a lovely piece of, I feel that way about Gary's buildings for that matter too, which I quite enjoy. I think they're wonderful buildings, but there's a little bit of a problem, I think, when you have that mindset about what buildings are, that you sort of say, well, really, what did we do? We took a form that you have to have, which is an auditorium, and we put a really lovely thing over the top of it, which doesn't really kind of connect that well. So there's a little bit of authenticity to that I'm comfortable with.
Yeah, well, and you can't do it very often and pull it off. I mean, it has to be done at a certain level, and Gary's been successful in being able to do it a couple of times, but not every time.
He misses a lot too. Yes, I've seen quite a few of his things, and a lot of them are duds.
But I thought the Gherkin, as that sort of building for London, actually was quite interesting, and I liked it. And it's way out there in terms of trying to relate to anything around it.
And it's a Foster building, isn't it?
And there's the Shard that's now come to London is on a very different scale. That's piano, and he's doing something different. But I mean, they're all kind of very special buildings, and everyone can't do those, and every project shouldn't be like that.
Sure.
And yet a lot of architects probably think they can.
It's not by Rogers, it's by the Italian.
Piano.
Yes, piano.
Yeah, Rienzo. Well, what have we missed?
The last question of post-1975.
Which buildings constructed in Queensland after 75 do you consider significant? 75. Well, that would be
after 70. Well, I'm an alien through that period of time. I had an architect from America recently here, and we were driving around all the time looking at things, and he kept asking me questions about architecture here, and I couldn't answer them. I said, I'm an alien. I haven't been here for 30 years.
Have you been to Goma?
I missed it all.
Have you been to Goma?
Goma.
The Gallery of Modern Art.
Oh, yes.
Which is next to Gibson's.
Oh, well, there you are. That's a significant building, but that's not in Queensland.
Yes, it is.
It's in Brisbane.
I'm thinking the one in Hobart. No, I'm sorry.
Gallery of Modern Art next to Gibson.
It's post 75. It's difficult, that building. Probably in some ways I have more time for what was done with Gibson's building to change the library. Certainly inside I think there's some nice things happening, but Gibson's probably horrified by what Hill did to it. But
I mean, have you seen other things that Tim Hill's done?
Yes, I have. I actually did some work on a house he did over on Stradbroke Island, and I have seen and like immensely a little tiny house that he's done down in New Farm, which is on a corner. He sort of bermed the sidewalk as you walk along, and you walk through a bermed area with trees and walk into a little courtyard. I think he's actually living in that place.
It's the D house.
Yes, okay.
Which was considered the best house in Australia in the year it went in the awards.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a good house.
Well, me too.
I don't know a lot of buildings through that period.
Well, there's.
I
mean, Philip Cox has done.
There's a group of architects. There's kind of like there's always like little schools of architects, aren't there? Like the Sunshine Coast region has like a little school of architects, and they have there's an ilk to them.
Well, Gabriel
Poole has been part of, and the
Lindsay
Clares have been part of, and John Mainwaring has been part of, and Maury Hurst probably a bit. And they create a nice body of work that area has, and I think that's good, and that's continuing on. There's bark designs up here now. They've sort of all grown out of each other. They're the same sort of egg, and I think regionally you could go anywhere and find some of that. There's parts of Melbourne where you sort of say, well, there's a story that Frank Lloyd Wright would go to a town where he'd been asked to do a house, and he'd get out of the car, and whoever was driving him around, he'd say, just keep driving around a bit till we go past one or two of my buildings. And that was true, because there was a school that was so significant of that prairie style that you could almost go anywhere into any suburb in America and drive around the streets for a while, and you'd say, well, there's a Wrightian building, there's that influence. Well, I think we have that happening always, and that's, you drive around Toorak in Melbourne, and it's different than driving around Hamilton in Brisbane or Double Bay or somewhere in Sydney. But it's only different in the sense that there's a likeness to it. There's a likeness to what goes on, because there's a certain group of architects that did things in a like way. There's Clarendon and Boyd and all these people, and they did things in that region, and so there's a certain kind of popping up of that same feeling. And you get that up here to some degree. You get that a little bit around Noosa. I don't know that you get it so much in Sydney or Brisbane, because I haven't driven around enough to see that, but it probably is that this. You could probably take a whole lot of photographs of buildings through that period of time and put them on the table here and look at them, and with some insights you could probably say which part of Australia they come from, and which city they're in, without too much difficulty.
So do you think that also happened when you were practicing in Brisbane?
Well, it was because of, you know, the names we've mentioned, like Prangley and Croft and John Dalton and Hayes and Scott. There was a school.
So did you associate your work with theirs? Do you think do you associate your work with theirs? Do you think it's in the same?
No, I don't think I do, and I don't think it'd be fair to make that alignment. I think my work came out of not being educated here, and I think my work came out of influences that weren't here. I think that I brought with me from Melbourne the sort of terrace house idea and tried to implant that into Grenier Street in the sense that it was a terrace house. You know, it's two walls of brick buildings going up through 3 floors. So it's not a Queenslander in that concept way. And I think also because I'd had that sort of Bauhaus, more international influence, which I don't think had infiltrated Brisbane to a degree at that stage, although I'm sure that was somewhat true of Dalton and Hayes and Scott and these people, because they were contemporary architects in that way of, you know, influence. But I don't think that the Queenslander was, you know, what I was about. And I don't think that became true when I did a few other little buildings. Like, I think the Wilson's house is kind of an American beach house in many ways, because it's a Cape Cod influence from that period of time. And I think the little houses that I did in Brookfield, those areas, were sort of like, they were the early sheds of what Australia got onto further down the road, but they were shed architecture, you know, they were skillion roof, long, thin sort of things that were fairly flimsy looking, and that's sort of the way that worked in my thoughts.
What about California? Were you interested in what was going on there, or what had gone on there? I mean, Schindler and the case study houses and...
well, I knew them, you know. I even knew them before I went to America. Having struggled with names, but there was a guy who was the influence in California in terms of those case study houses.
Craig Elwood.
Craig Elwood, of course. Yeah, I think that's true. If you work in America in different places, and I have done work in a variety of places, you sort of get you get the ilk of the place as what is changing how you go about things and how you think about things. Obviously, that's climatic and otherwise, but it's also, America's less homogenous than Australia is, in the sense that you can go around Australia, and I spent a bit of time in Tasmania because Sue's brother lives down there, and you can sense there's a sort of a Tasmanian mentality. It's an island to start with, and there's quite clearly different mindsets in this country and different sort of cultural feelings, but they're embellished more in countries like America. You know, they're emphatically different in certain parts of the country, and so when you live in the Midwest, which is what culturally Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit is, it's got a culture, mindset, attitude, politic that is different from California and different from New England and different from the South. And so when you go to do work in these places, you pick up that, you know. And if you live in Colorado for a long period of time like I have, there's a mountain mindset that really is, it's a fascinating place, because it's you know, it's true that you're never an Australian or an American in the sense that you really are more localised in those terms involved, and you don't really live in Australia. You really live in the Sunshine Coast, or you know, there's a saying that all culture is local and all politics is up the road, and it really is true in terms of, you know, what you are about. And so to pretend that you're broader than that is sort of not really where you are, and and so that means that I didn't really live in America. I really lived in Colorado, and so the nature of that place is dominantly what my experience is there. And quite obviously that's been wonderful, and it's been wonderful because it's sort of not the America that people think of being America. It's the mind area, the ski areas of Colorado were established by Europeans who came out there after the Second World War, and they were invited to do that by some Americans from the 10th Division, who were the soldiers that fought in the Alps of Italy and were absolutely fascinated by this whole mountain culture and climate and skiing and all this stuff, which America didn't really have. So they came back and brought that to that area. And so it has, there's a joke in Colorado that sort of, when you go to a meeting, people look at you and they say, "Oh, is there an American here at this meeting?" There's this Railton from Australia, there's this other, my partner was from France, and then there's another guy who was working with us that was from Italy, and now we've got a guy who's from Ireland there, and it's the centre of Buddhist studies in America. It's the centre of an enormous number of institutes. It's the atmospheric research studies centre, and so it brings a lot of. There's an Australian American Association in Denver, which I was a member of. There's a lot of people from Australia, from other parts. The ski industry there works enormously on the basis of a cross ski agreement between Australia and New Zealand there, whereby the people who work in that industry work in those industries during what is the Australian and New Zealand ski season, and then they go over and work in the other 6 months in that ski season. So there's that thing happening. It's also an area which has an enormously significant population that's Hispanic, and it goes way back to the early days of farming there. And so there's like third and fourth generation Mexican people who are part of that place. And they are very significant in the construction industry because they dominate the hard trades. If you have anything done there and you have some guy turn up to do stonework or masonry or concrete work or tile work or plaster work or any of those things, they're going to be Mexican in background because those are the trades,
Did you go to Mexico?
Yes, I went a couple of years ago again. Yeah.
And
it is so beautiful. You can look around. You can go to a place like San Miguel Alondre, and you can stand there and you can look around. You can say, "I can't see anything I don't like. I can't see anything ugly." It mightn't be great architecture, but it's all so beautiful. It's all wonderful colours and wonderful shapes and wonderful things. Wonderful landscaping. They're great at landscaping. They can do fountains.
We interviewed Graham Thedeke, and he spent quite a long time in Mexico and had a practice there. Yeah,
he worked for Davis Head and Dysart when I was working there, because they had an office in Surfers Paradise, and he was in charge of that office.
Right.
Yeah.
And you said you worked for David Bell.
Oh,
tell us about him.
David Bell. His father was a furniture manufacturer, and they had Bell Furniture down in the valley.
Brunswick Street.
And yes, and of course my father, being a furniture manufacturer, knew him. And I was looking for a job, and I thought, wouldn't it be nice, seeing it's the summertime, if I worked down on the Gold Coast instead of Brisbane? So I got on my motor scooter and headed down to the Gold Coast, where he was working at the back of his house in Surfers Paradise, and he was doing a major project, which was the Corman being a Melbourne developer at that time, Chevron Hotel. So I worked on that for the summer
exciting.
Yeah.
Now, it was one of two significant hotels being built there. There was the Carl Langer one.
That's right, in Broadbeach.
So they were very different.
Yes.
What do you think about them?
I liked the Broadbeach one very much. I thought it was, I thought that rubble stone wall with the with the butterfly roof, you know. That was good.
Butterfly roofs out here.
I thought, yes, that's nice.
But I mean, do you think the Chevron, it was very different? I mean, did you have a liking for one over the other? Or?
Oh, I liked the Carl Langer one a lot more. I didn't think the Chevron was that great. I think that I think there's certain sort of developers like Corman that really they turn architecture to a sort of a service to a large degree, you know, and they dominate what happens to it substantially. Yeah.
Did David Bell do work in Brisbane?
I really don't know, Robert. I don't know what he did beyond that. I imagine I don't know whether he had the office in Brisbane as well, or I know he was involved in the furniture side of it, because as well as having the office down there, he also had a furniture showroom and a furniture retail store.
Where was that? Southport or
no? It was right in Service Paradise, but which street I don't know. But he had a house which he lived in. He had a little building at the back which was a separate building, which was the office building, and then he had another building alongside of that which was the retail furniture store.
And when you worked at Prangley and Crofts, what did you work?
I worked with Prangley and Croft for, again, another sort of holiday. You know, like every time I was out of university, I went and got a job with another architect, and you know, they were really doing houses essentially. Ian Cinnamon was working there at that stage.
So all those, Pearl Assurance buildings came later.
I think they probably did, yes, because this was 1958, somewhere like that, you know. They were just a small office.
Well, Pat Moroney is one who would
have
been
and he was teaching at the University of Queensland when I was there, and he had worked, I think he'd worked for Grounds in Melbourne for some while, yeah.
Well, I can remember a little house that he did for himself.
Yes, I know that house. Yes,
Graceful or Chelmer or somewhere.
It was quite nice. It was a concrete block sort of structure.
But then he gave it away and became a sculptor.
Is that right? Oh.
But well, look, I think unless Janina, you've got something further, I think we'll draw it to a close. We could keep going all day, but I'm running out of, I can't remember what to ask you next.
That's all right.
Thank you.
That's all right.